Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining this event presented in the American Inspiration Author Series. It's great to have you with us today in the land of history, exploring the early days of our country, the New England frontier in the 1600s. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs at American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society, and I'm producer of the American Inspiration Author Series. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event featuring Malcolm Gaskill and his new book, The Ruin of All Witches, Life and Death in the New World. We're fortunate today that Professor Gaskill will present to us in full with illustrations for 40 minutes before addressing your questions. Before he gets started, some quick reminders for today. We are in a Zoom webinar format, which means your microphone is muted and your video is off. We can't take your comments in the chat box, but do look there for relevant information and helpful links. We asked for your questions as you registered. We've gotten a great collection of those covering many topics. If you have additional queries, enter them into the Q&A box at the base of your screen. We'll get to as many as we can. A video of tonight's program will be shared. The link will be emailed to all of you who registered when it's available in the American Inspiration Video Archive in the day ahead. So look for that in your email box. Of course, the real education and enlightenment comes from reading Professor Gaskill's celebrated book, The Ruin of All Witches, Life and Death in the New World. Copies can be purchased through our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Mass. Unfortunately, signed editions are not available for this particular event, but all the same, the book creates for us a full picture of colonial life. The New York Times called it a riveting history of life in a 17th century New England frontier town, sharing the stress of isolation, foul weather, disease, and death. Other reviewers said The Ruin of All Witches is the perfect read for history enthusiasts, those interested in the history of witchcraft, accusations, and readers of women's history. Another called it an intriguing, vivid, and often frightening study. I agree on all fronts. As someone descended from the settlers of Hartford, Connecticut, I found this book to be truly fascinating. Before Professor Gaskill starts in on his presentation, I want to share just a bit of background on him. Malcolm Gaskill is Emeritus Professor of Early Modern History at the University of East Anglia. One of Britain's leading experts in the history of witchcraft, his works include the highly acclaimed Witchfinders, a 17th century English tragedy, and Between Two Worlds, How the English Became Americans. Professor Gaskill, welcome. It is such an honor to have you with us, really a thrill, and I can't imagine a better afternoon program for all of us. We are all intrigued by your work. We are a crowd of history lovers, as I told you. Many of us are fans of NEHGS honorary trustee Stacy Schiff and her work. So we do a lot of programs on witches, and certainly numerous of them on American history. So we are so keen to hear your perspective and to hear more. So thank you for your book, and thanks for being with us today. Over to you.
Right. Thank you so much, Margaret, for that incredibly warm welcome. And thanks also for inviting me here today. This is fantastic. And this huge stadium audience that I know you've got out there, quite far the biggest audience I've ever spoken to in my life. So thank you all for turning out today to listen to me talk about the ruin of all witches. I think Kathleen's going to put the first slide up. We're going to go to the next one. There we go. Right. So you see a couple not getting on very well there, and this really is rather a sad story about a difficult marriage and the devil in the background. That's why I thought this was quite an appropriate slide. Well, this isn't going to be a general talk about witches. It's not even going to be a general talk about witches in New England, although we could pick up perhaps some of those in those questions afterwards. Really is rather the opposite. This is a specific case told as a narrative. Well, all witchcraft cases are alike in some ways. There's usually a sense of threat, of of devilry, and of the use of unnatural power. Yet when we look at them close up, they're always different and irregular. They're human. So my narrative embraces both the general and the specific, but above all, it's a story, even a kind of real life folk tale or fairy tale. All the elements of those things are present. G.K. Chesterton once said that fairy tales don't teach children about the nature of monsters or witches. Fairy tales teach them that witches and monsters can be defeated. So there's a message of hope for the future in that, for greater safety, for prevalence, and for survival. And so hope lay in the ruin of all witches. Well, that's what people in Springfield believed anyway. Once upon a time, there stood a small town by a great river, just a few wooden houses and barns, set along a rough track at the edge of a deep forest. The people who lived there came from far away across land and sea, and on this remote frontier, they laboured to eat, raise families, and rebuild something of the world they'd once known. Well, the values of their old world were industry and charity and piety, all good things that made a community strong and favourable to God. And yet each of these values had its dark side. Industry bred competition, envy and greed as men jostled for land and wealth and influence. Charity required discrimination because the criteria for inclusion was sharpened by exclusion, and similarly cherished conformity was sharpened by detested non-conformity. And thirdly, piety meant standards of godliness, again mirrored by an unholy opposite, sinfulness, and the origin of sinfulness, devilishness. So negative emotions ran through all these virtues then, and were projected sometimes onto the figure of the witch. And the witch was a kind of anti-saint, anti-neighbour, anti-wife, anti-mother, anti-everything, but could sometimes be a man. Well, there'd been a good many witches in the old world. Most county assizes in England saw one or two strung up at the gallows, at least in the reigns of Elizabeth I and James I. So that's the couple of decades either side of the year 1600. But here in New England, in more than 20 years of permanent settlement, there'd been none, almost as if these emigrants, these new Israelites in their promised land, had managed to leave the devil behind them. Well, until the mid-1640s, that is, as tensions rose, doubts set in, and rumours spread of some who had renounced Christ and plotted secret war against their godly neighbours. Meanwhile, friends and family across the ocean had been plunged into civil war, and overseeing this spasm of hatred and violence was, in their minds, Satan, whose alleged acolytes in the eastern counties of England were being rounded up. Between 1645 and 1647, some 300 people were questioned and about 100 of them were executed in a campaign that was orchestrated, initiated by this man, the so-called witchfinder general Matthew Hopkins, and his associate John Stern. Well, for them, as for all Puritans, the devil pact was the essence of the crime, but this was incredibly difficult to prove without confessions or some other kind of hard evidence, such as a bodily mark where the devil's imps were supposed to feed. Well, what the witchfinders did is that they procured both these things. Well, news of what was happening in England spread to America, which was really inevitable given the constant traffic across the Atlantic and the links between the New England colonies and the Puritan heartland of the Stour Valley, which straddled the counties of Essex and Suffolk, where the English witch hunt was most intense. Well, in part, there was a sense that the devil was making gains amongst God's people, and that he was raging now precisely because Puritans were winning the war against the forces, winning against the forces of Antichrist in England and the forces of what they saw as paganism amongst Native Americans across the Atlantic. But the news from East Anglia did something else. It also suggested techniques for finding witches, not just that there were witches there, but that actually they could be found out. And also that one could get hold of proof to use at law. So back to G.K. Chesterton and the idea that teaching that witches didn't just exist, but that they could be defeated. So from 1647, you start to find legal cases creeping across New England, including a sensational trial in Boston. In the summer of 1648, a woman called Margaret Jones, who was a midwife in Charleston, was accused and indicted as a witch. And the Boston court ordered that she be watched and searched, quote, "the course which hath been used in England for discovery of witches, the best and surest way," unquote. Well, Jones was convicted on several charges, including, quote, she was found to have a malignant touch, and that when she was searched, an apparent teat was found, as they said, as fresh as if it had been newly sucked. Well, Margaret Jones was hanged in Boston before a huge crowd, and her husband was also suspected in this instance. When he tried to flee by ship, he was accused of making the ship rock on the Charles River as if it was in a storm, even though it was a very still day. So witchcraft, it seemed, could be a family affair involving husbands and wives, even husbands and wives who accused one another. Well, at the heart of my story is a woman called Mary Lewis. This isn't actually her, it's just something for you to look at while I'm talking about her. We don't really know what she looked like. But back in her native Wales, we do know this: she had a husband, and that husband turned out to be a bad penny. He was a Catholic in what was, after all, a Protestant country, who first bullied her, then deserted her. And by 1640, Mary Lewis found there was nothing left for her in Wales. So she came to New England like so many others did. She entered domestic service, and around 1641, she ended up in the small town by the great river at the edge of a deep forest, the name of which was Springfield. Mary's days were spent looking after the daughters of her mistress, Anne Smith, who became her confidant and knew about Mary's marital predicament, namely that she was married, but she needed a new husband. Well, days became weeks, weeks, months, and the months years, until the spring of 1645, when a man arrived in Springfield, a man Mary rather liked the look of. He was strong and fit, a worker in his prime, wearing a red waistcoat and a lined cap. He also had a mysterious air about him. He didn't say much, but he seemed to take in everything about him, beady-eyed and beetle-browed through a haze of pipe smoke. His name was Hugh Parsons, and he soon noticed Mary too, and before long a match was made. Well, Mary confided in Anne Smith, who arranged a meeting with her father, and her father was the founder, magistrate, chief employer, landlord and overlord of Springfield, William Pynchon. You see him here. Pynchon was also a learned, if amateur, theologian whose ideas steered not only away from the orthodoxy of the Church of England, but even from the Puritan orthodoxy of New England. Well, this was heresy. And William Pynchon, the colonial pioneer, and William Pynchon, the heretic, become the cornerstone of this tale. Not only did his dissent contribute to Springfield's sense in the end of having lost its way, but his downfall and that of the Parsonses become intertwined. Pynchon had started out as an obscure minor gentleman and churchwarden in a very small village near the town of Chelmsford in Essex, in southeast England, who in 1630 threw in his lot with the mass migrations to New England. He crossed the Atlantic with his family and he settled on the East Coast, where he traded in the beaver pelts which were in such great demand at home. It was a grueling life, but Pynchon has something special about him. He has this spark of ruthless ambition that will see him through. By 1636, he had journeyed 100 miles west of the Connecticut Valley and staked a claim in territory the local Native Americans called Agawam, but that the English soon renamed Springfield. Well, Springfield was planned from the start as a godly town because Pynchon was a godly man. But unlike many of the other Puritan congregations transplanted from England in and around Boston, this was a town which was built for trade and for profit. Well, Pynchon was an intrepid yet cautious man. He's always weighing up his options, calculating risk and advantage. And he does this really rather remarkable thing. He breaks away from the authority of the colony of Connecticut, and he puts Springfield under the jurisdiction of Massachusetts, basically because he thinks that's really where his best advantage lies. So he's very, very cautious, but he knows when to act when necessary. But when he's presented with Mary Lewis's dilemma, which might seem quite a sort of trivial thing, he takes this incredibly seriously, and he's very cautious. He doesn't rule on it himself. He seeks approval from his superiors in Boston, who then confirm that because Mary had been separated from her husband for 7 years, she was free to marry. The town's minister was informed, and a date was set for Mary and Hugh's wedding, the 27th of October, 1645. Sorry, just before we change the slide, this is the letter you see here on the slide that Pynchon writes to Boston, setting out the problem of Mary Lewis's marriage and asking permission for her to marry. Right, sorry, next slide, please, Catherine. Well, the minister's name was George Moxon. He was a Lancashire Puritan from the north of England who had fled after falling foul of the church for neglecting the orthodox rituals that Puritans condemned as idolatrous. Well, like so many other of Springfield's colonists, Moxon had been lured to Springfield by William Pynchon, whose stratagem this was whenever the young town needed specialist workers for its advancement. Moxon's preaching was gentle, inclusive, and spoke fondly of God's love, but in time his tone would become more severe as he and his flock were drawn into darker and more dangerous days. These are William Pynchon's son, John. These are his shorthand notes that he took on Moxon's sermons. It was actually set as homework for him, a rare survival of some mid-17th century homework here. But we're very grateful to him because then we know what Moxon was talking about. Moxon was Pynchon's closest ally, and he's a very important person in the story, and he plays a decisive role in the future of Hugh and Mary, and conversely, they in his. Well, New England weddings were civil affairs in the Dutch Calvinist fashion. Rings were considered to be pagan symbols and, like all ungodly things, were by implication associated with the devil. Vows were exchanged, that was okay, and Reverend Moxon enjoined the couple to live peaceably in the sight of God and within the covenant of this new community. There probably would have been some modest celebration that night, maybe with beer and cakes, but without singing or dancing, which were forbidden as disorderly and devilish under Massachusetts law. Well, now Mary had a husband, and crucially for forming a household, her husband had work. Pynchon had hired Hugh Parsons because Parsons was a brickmaker, just as he'd hired Moxon to supply the town's spiritual needs. And ambitious William Pynchon wanted his town to be as independent as possible. So again, whenever they needed something, they hired somebody to make it. And these days, some men, George Moxon, the minister among them, were doing rather well in Springfield, and they wanted to replace their old mud and timber chimneys. Brick chimneys were, after all, safer. They didn't catch fire, obviously, but they were also status symbols in a new community where status symbols and the differentiation of the classes becomes so important early on. They take it for granted in England, but New England is still making this stuff up for itself. So a week before his wedding, Hugh signs this contract you see here to make as many bricks as could be had for 19 shillings and sixpence. It was the first of many such bargains, brightening Hugh's prospects and also, I think, in a way, sealing his fate. Well, Hugh was allotted land and a house in the south end of the town where many newcomers settled, a mixture of ordinary working people, artisans and farmers, typically both from England and Wales. And there, in the autumn of 1645, Hugh and Mary moved in, and we must assume, for a while at least, they were happy. After all, they had both fulfilled their dreams in America. Well, Mary works hard to keep the house clean, to cook Hugh's meals, mostly, I think, porridge and bread made from maize, fish from the Connecticut River, some milk and some butter, and with the colder months, preserves from the cellar, salt pork and cheese and the like. Hugh, meanwhile, the provider, worked all hours, not only making bricks, but tending crops and livestock, as well as doing jobs for William Pynchon, as all men did, including canoeing Pynchon's furs downriver. In truth, their lives were viable on this lonely frontier only because, as in all households, William Pynchon gave them credit at his store, where all things from clothes and tools to food and medicine could be had. This is Hugh's account, recording what he bought, offset against everything he supplied, mainly his labour, and this survives in the Forbes Library in Northampton, Kathleen, where I know Kathleen comes from. This is where it's an incredible sort of a window on the lost world of Springfield. The whole of Springfield is contained within this account book. And so Hugh and Mary spent their first winter together, and soon Mary discovered that she was pregnant. After looking after Anne Smith's children for so long, now she'd have a child of her own. Well, Hannah Parsons was born the following August 1646, and all the female neighbours rallied round to help. As in the old world, the gossip network was vital for a woman's survival, so it was absolutely vital that she stayed on the right side of these women. Many babies perished in Springfield from seasonal flu, attacks of smallpox, probably from diphtheria, I think, as well. And Reverend Moxon and the gravedigger were kept busy at the riverside burial ground. Yet Hannah survived and thrived, and after a dreadful summer when caterpillars destroyed much of the plantation's wheat and barley, Hugh worked ever harder to feed his family, but also not just for subsistence, but actually to get ahead as well. Into 1647, Hugh's contemplative moods became downright bad moods. Mary did what she could to placate him, but the cloud on his brow grew darker, and he resented Mary wasting time, as he would have said, on a child that could have been spent on work. And out of the house, Hugh starts behaving in an extremely intemperate way, casting aspersions on people, bridling at slights real and imagined, quarrelling over his brick deals. His manner and conduct didn't improve even when in September 1647, Mary became pregnant with her second child. On the contrary, his demeanour was blacker than ever. William Pynchon, meanwhile, continued to deal with the local Native Americans, buying up land, but things grew tense, and the year 1648 saw Anglo-Indian relations deteriorate throughout the Connecticut Valley. There were other trials in the summer of that year. A strange plague of flies crawled out of the ground and ate crops, and a biblical cloud of pigeons descended to eat the wheat. Also, Mary's former mistress, Anne Smith, lost two of her daughters. Remember, these were William Pynchon's granddaughters, to a strange, unexplained illness. Well, by now, Springfield was growing very quickly. Mary's baby, Samuel, was born in the June of 1648, and many other babies besides. New settlers also arrived in town, and each was given a home lot branching west off Main Street. You can probably just about see here on this map, leading down towards the Connecticut River, across which lay the planting grounds, and then back the other side of the Connecticut River on the east side of Main Street there, the woodlots. Also, more land was being made available, including the so-called Long Meadow, which was a large tract of pasture land south of the Mill River, right at the bottom of this map. And some men actually decided to make their homes down there. But this was still very much a tight-knit society that depended on obedience to authority and cooperation between neighbours. And here, even more than in England, there was this sense of danger, I think. Not only were these people 3,000 miles from home, as they still thought of it, but there were Native Americans and wolves and epidemics and hostile colonists, and of course God, ready to judge them if they failed, plus this general non-specific pervasive fear of the unknown. These were people as colonists who had to stick together, but all too often they were at loggerheads, and the worst of them was Hugh Parsons. When he got home in the evenings, Hugh began behaving cruelly towards Mary, venting his frustrations and his wider sense of thwarted ambition, I think, upon her. The devil was undoubtedly in him. Once he raised a piece of wood as if to strike her. Another time he deliberately spilt a dish of peas and made her pick them up. He also doused the fire and pulled the sheets from her bed. Clearly, Mary was already troubled in body and mind before these outrages, and Hugh had been forced to increase his credit at Pinch and Store in order to buy pills to purge and heal her. But now she retreated into her old misery and fell deeper, far deeper than she had in Wales, now that there was no escape from this man, this house, and this life so far from home. The disorder of her mind couldn't be contained within her increasingly disordered household. She began to behave strangely among her neighbours in South Springfield. She was noticeably concerned, some thought obsessed, with the possibility that there were witches in town. There had, after all, been a few trials and executions in New England. And Mary's paranoid fear settled on one woman in particular, Mercy Marshfield, a widow recently arrived from Windsor, a township further down the Connecticut Valley. Mary began confiding in others that Mercy Marshfield had brought the devil with her and had bewitched a child and the cow of her neighbour to death. Well, once word got back to widow Marshfield, there was trouble. In May 1649, Mercy Marshfield sued for slander and won. William Pynchon judged the case and chose to believe the witnesses, who swore on oath that Mercy Marshfield was a blameless person and Mary Parsons was a difficult and disturbing person. She was ordered to be whipped, but accepted a commuted sentence of a fine to be paid in maize. Hugh was furious that his wife should cost them this, and Mary, for her part, made things worse by saying that the witnesses had perjured themselves. Well, Hugh and Mary were now at war with each other, as well as their neighbours. That summer, the increasingly fearful and discordant mood in Springfield took a peculiar turn when William Pynchon ascended the pulpit in the meeting house and delivered a sermon to his people. Moxon already knew of William Pynchon's views, as did others, but now these would become much more publicly known, and the heretical implications allowed to curdle with suspicions of witchcraft. William Pynchon was also dangerously writing a book. Pynchon believed that Christ had atoned for mankind's sins not by suffering God's wrath at the crucifixion, but rather through a voluntary display of perfect obedience by a son to his Father. There had been wrath at the crucifixion, he said, but it was Satan's. It was Satan who provoked Christ's executioners, and Satan who goaded Christ into resenting God for allowing him to die. The message was clear. Not only was this a dangerous departure from the Calvinist orthodoxy upheld in Boston, it also reinforced the idea that the devil raged among them, as wrathful as he'd been at Calvary. But autumn brought more sickness, including into the Parsons household. In October, little Samuel Parsons died, and also 5 weeks later their lodger, Sarah Dorchester. Her husband, Anthony, who hated Hugh, grieved for her. Shortly before Sarah died, Anthony had got hold of a cheap piece of meat, the root of a cow's tongue, which he boiled up to make broth for his ailing wife. But when he returned from the town meeting that Sunday, the meat had gone from the pot, stolen or perhaps magicked away by some jealous person, someone like Hugh Parsons. When Hugh wasn't being cruel at home or irascible with his neighbours, he was alone with his troubled thoughts out in the long meadow south of town. Sometimes that summer he came home late, or he didn't come home at all, but just slept out in the fields gazing up at the moon and the stars. At home, he slept fitfully as if lost to some other place where he fought with demons who pricked him in his stomach. Mary watched, worried about who, in truth, he really might be. She even tried to search his body for the devil's marks as he slept, and he in turn suspected her of witchcraft and suggested they search her body. Well, she declined to let him, saying that this was an immodest thing. In the spring of 1650, widow Marshfield's daughter, Sarah Miller, began having seizures, crying that Hugh was afflicting her. Well, by now, her mother believed that Hugh was a witch, and so did Anthony Dorchester, the lodger. The rumours pulsed through Springfield all year long. If Hugh heard them, he did nothing to rescue his reputation. All his brick deals seemed to end in rancour. "I'll be even with you." That was his furious refrain. He even fell out with Mr. Moxon, the minister, predictably over some chimneys, and it was not long before Moxon's daughters, Martha and Rebecca, also began having fits as if molested by demons. Back at home, Mary Parsons gave birth to their third child, another son, Joshua. But now the turmoil of her mind grew more violent and her delusions darker, more distressing. One Sunday, sitting in the alehouse, Mary started gabbling about her fear she had of her husband, and then suddenly she went into a kind of trance where she felt that her soul was being transported to a neighbour's home lot, where she cavorted with Hugh and other shape-shifting witches. Well, these strange afflictions spread to others. It felt like Springfield was under some kind of demonic attack. What could have encouraged such an assault? Some wondered if William Pynchon might be to blame. By now, his strange book had arrived in America from the printers in London. It hits Boston like a bombshell and was roundly condemned as heretical, a provocation to heaven, no less. Pynchon, they said, would have to recant to restore order and orthodoxy in this fragile territory, which without God's approbation and protection could actually cease to exist if that crucial covenant with his people was broken. Magistrates and elders in Boston ordered the book to be burned, to steer people away from religious error, to uphold civil authority, and to appease heaven. The God who so loved his chosen people in New England now seemed very angry with them. In the late February of 1651, it was still winter, but Springfield was through the worst of it. By now, not only had Hugh's conduct become intolerable, but his wife seemed either insane or possessed, certainly gripped by melancholy. And there had been misfortunes, mostly small domestic matters, some failed puddings, discoloured milk, missing tools, yet these things were symbolic of a spiteful man interfering with people's daily lives. Neighbours went to William Pynchon, who recorded their complaints and issued warrants for the arrest of Hugh and Mary Parsons. Slowly, yet inexorably, the wheels of justice began to turn. As Hugh was being led by the constable down the main street, you see here in this illustration, a woman called Anne Stebbins fell into fits, crying, "Ah, witch, ah, witch." Well, things looked incredibly bad for Hugh, something he reflected on that night as he lay chained up by the constable's fireplace. And we can notice by this point that there's this sort of arc in the story over several months where what start out as whispers of witchcraft have become open finger pointing. Well, William Pynchon knew all about the East Anglian witch hunt and the methods of the witch finders, Hopkins and Stern. As it happens, he'd actually been one of the judges at the court which had convicted the midwife Margaret Jones in Boston in 1648. The idea that beasts-like demons, demonic spirits, might feed on the witch's body was well established, and Pynchon ordered Mary to be watched that night to see if her imps might come as they had done in England. Well, no imp did come that night, but Mary did once again express the fear that she had of her husband, who she thought was a witch. Well, in the days ahead, the townsfolk came in great numbers to see William Pynchon, and from early March 1651 crowded into the meeting house to have their complaints recorded. The atmosphere must have been electrifying, as these two thorns were plucked from the town side, and the truth of their wickedness was laid bare in sight of God and man. A woman called Blanche Bedorfer, a Welshwoman, told how she had once snapped at Hugh Parsons when her husband had been negotiating a brick deal, and Hugh had snapped back at her. Well, she then subsequently suffered agonising, terrifying birth pangs. But the most extraordinary revelation that came out was Hugh's reaction to news of his son Samuel's death. Apparently, he hadn't shown any emotion, but had just ambled off to a neighbour's house for a smoke. This seemed very strange, even incriminating. Was he glad that his son was dead? Had he in fact caused Samuel's death, perhaps to free up his wife's time to help him with his work? Hugh, listening to these accusations, said he was, quote, very full of sorrow for his son's death, but, quote, in private, though not in public, unquote. He was stunned. He had tried to be a man, but in this claustrophobic community of Springfield, he'd got it wrong. A day or so later, there was a terrible development, another terrible development. The baby, Joshua Parsons, was found dead, with his mother still under house arrest. The assumption was that she'd killed him, and she didn't deny it either. Well, in a case like this, no investigation was necessary. Now the focus turned to Mary Parsons, however disturbed, as a witness against her husband. Her loyalty was no longer to him, but to justice and the common peace. As soon as she was invited to appear in the meeting house, Mary denounced Hugh. She said this: "I have often entreated him to confess whether he were a witch or no," she said. She suspected vehemently that he'd bewitched their son Samuel to death, not least because of that complete lack of emotion. Much of the testimony against Hugh described his unmanly anger towards his neighbours and also towards his wife, spilling the peas, the threat with the block of wood, and so on. William Pynchon put it to Hugh in the presence of his wife and all the town that, when you look at the slide, look at the red underlining on the slide here, he said, put it to him, "This expression of your anger was because she, Mary, wished the ruin of all witches." Hugh admitted that he was angry and he was impatient, but as for being a witch, he was as innocent as a child and really had no more to say. As ever, Hugh Parsons remained silent for the rest of the hearing. By the third week of March, William Pynchon had a weighty file of testimony suggesting that Hugh Parsons was a witch. Hugh's wife Mary, who by now had also confessed to giving herself to the devil and, remember, stood accused of murdering her own child, was equally reviled. But their crimes were too serious to be tried in Springfield. Instead, Hugh and Mary had to be sent 100 miles east along the Old Bay path to Boston, where learned judges could weigh the proofs and a jury could determine guilt. In due course, William Pynchon would have to go too, not only because he had to present the evidence and prosecute Hugh and Mary on behalf of the town, but because he was being summoned to recount his heretical opinions. And there, alas, we must leave these strange people in troubled and turbulent Springfield in the spring of 1641, which had now become a cauldron of witchcraft and heresy, a frontier plantation too far away, it seemed, from the godly hubs of the eastern seaboard, too exposed to devilish temptation. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, the ruin of all witches had not actually purged the town of evil or restored it to the road of righteousness, for the wickedness that accusers saw in others was always still there in themselves. Thank you. Now, I think we're going back over to Margaret now, who's going to supervise questions, which I'm very happy to.
Spectacular. I so enjoyed that reading and your narrative.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We have so many advanced questions that have come in, more than 150, and there are many coming in online. I know, a very popular topic. Just to start off with one very general one, how did you come across this particular couple? And did you have any ties to Springfield? Of course, everyone wants to know if you're descendant from this couple. But tell us, how you chose them as your subjects.
Well, I'm probably descended from them somewhere, because that long back into the past, everyone's related to everybody, but I don't know of any. It would be nice if I were. I do have Salem descendants. There were Gaskills in Salem. Fortunately, Quakers who were on the side of the accused rather than on the side of the accusers. So I have a clean conscience about that. So how did I find Hugh and Mary? Well, kind of, when you've studied witchcraft for a long time, 30 years in my case, you tend to kind of know a lot of the key cases, but you don't always look at them in detail. And you don't always think that there's a detailed story there to be told. I'd written a book, I mentioned the story of the East Anglian witch hunt. I'd written a book about that. And I'd also, my last book was called Between Two Worlds, which was about English colonization of America across the whole of the 17th century. And there was quite a lot of witches in there too. And this book is a kind of bridge between those two stories, between the old world and the new, between old world witch hunting and new world witch hunting. And so I'd kind of mentioned the Springfield case just in passing in the in Between Two Worlds, but I just thought it was just such a good story. I just thought I'd look a bit more closely. And of course, when I did look more closely, I found that there really was enough information there to tell quite a detailed story and to reconstruct their world for them, so that, you know, quite often with witchcraft cases, we know the details of the accusation, the sorts of things people are accused of, but we don't know that rich context of the world that makes all those things make sense. And that's really what I had in the case of Hugh and Mary.
Well, I loved seeing all the old documents and letters, and a question has come up about what resources you used to cultivate this new information, to pull it out. How or where do you do your research? And very generally, one viewer asks, how do you manage to find such detailed information from so long ago? So some general comments on your research process.
Yeah, okay, well, just taking that the last first, I mean, these are there's in the New York Public Library, there is an amazing manuscript, which is William Pynchon's own set of depositions, so that we've got this record of people coming to Pynchon talking about themselves and their lives. And not just the details of that, they say how they felt. So, you know, some people have flattered me about this book and said it kind of reads like a novel, but you can't really know how they felt. But I didn't make that stuff up, because actually these people do describe how they feel. They say people are envious, they say I'm frightened, and they say that, you know, I'm anxious, and all, so that actually you can put all that stuff in there. So that's really the core of this book, is that set of depositions in the New York Public Library. There are some other key sources. We've got very good births, marriages and deaths records for Springfield. We also have William Pynchon, I mentioned earlier, William Pynchon's own account book, which is, again, as I say, this snapshot of every single person in Springfield, every household, and everything they bought and everything they did for him. We can really reconstruct this world. We have Moxon sermons, I mentioned also, and there are lots of other smaller records, but you know, you put it all together, and also you take evidence from other places in the Connecticut Valley at this time for weather and stuff like that, and you can just start to piece it together like a jigsaw to try to get this you know, really rather unusually detailed world, I think. But it really mostly in the end comes down to Pynchon's depositions, which are, you know, apart from the records for the Salem witch trials, are incredibly rich and detailed, so that we don't just have this kind of stereotype view of things going wrong and people accusing someone. You know all their backstory, you know that they remember their own lives and all their relations going back a long time. And we see that actually here witchcraft accusations are quite a slow burning thing, rather than just some knee-jerk reaction to things going wrong or not liking somebody in the neighborhood.
Was the town unique in having this wealth of records? Did it have anything to do with it being a center for trade and profit? You know, how unique was that?
Well, it's not unique. In fact, the records for New England townships tend to be actually pretty good, quite better often than they are for a lot of English villages and towns. But I don't know, it's not, you know, I suppose you could think about Springfield as being kind of proto-capitalist, but it's not modern in the way that we think. It's not that they suddenly become very efficient record keepers. They live very much into the 18th century in the same sort of ways they really do live in England. And in fact, actually, William Pynchon himself he's not some kind of new American modern. He's actually a throwback to an older form of English overlord. He's like a lord of the manor at a time when those kind of lords of the manor, like feudal lords of the manor, are actually really on the wane. So quite a lot of what the colonists are doing in America is rather nostalgic for a version of England that doesn't exist anymore, or may actually never have existed far back in some golden age. So that they're kind of radical in some ways, but they're also remaking a world that they feel that they've lost at home.
Oh, that's fascinating. Stringing together a bunch of questions here. Folks are curious about Massachusetts in relationship to Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island at the time. Were these trials and, pervasive fears and suspicions, were they, prevalent across all those states I mentioned, Connecticut, New Hampshire? Rhode Island supposedly had much fewer accusations of witchery, witchcraft. There were fewer trials in Connecticut compared to Massachusetts, supposedly, and folks are curious, in your estimation, what made the difference between all these different states?
Right. Well, that's a very good question and a huge one. I'll try and be brief. I mean, the difference between New England colonies and the incidents and the distribution of witchcraft trials is really comparable to the difference in witchcraft, the incidents of witchcraft trials in counties in England, or between states in southern Germany, or regions of France in the 17th century. It all comes down to local political, cultural, religious conditions. So that witchcraft accusations, they rise and they take hold at certain political moments where the conditions just form a sort of perfect storm. So that there's a political will to do it, there is the legal wherewithal to do it, there's the right kind of tensions between neighbours. Witchcraft accusations are often, people are sometimes surprised that they're quite difficult to get going, witch trial. They're not happening all the time, they're not an easy thing to do. There is this due process of the law, and you do need lots of factors that come together rather peculiarly in a certain way for a witch trial to take off. So like I said, that sometimes there's this view that Puritans, and you think about Puritan Boston in the 1630s, you think they were so God-fearing and so opposed to the devil that they would have been accusing people left, right, and centre of witchcraft. Not at all. There are no cases for 20 years, and that's, I think, really mostly because you need that essential economic tension between neighbours, and that's what you're really starting to see. And also religious tension, I think, but you're starting to see that by the later 1640s. It kind of takes a generation for those old world conditions to get going. Rhode Island is just fantastically tolerant. A lot of people who go to Rhode Island are kind of exiles, as they are in Connecticut, but exiles from Boston who just can't really live under that kind of regime. Boston has this huge irony about it that they say we're going to get away from old world persecution, and then in order to enforce their own orthodoxy, they have to become persecutors themselves. So one of the things you can do is you can get out of Boston, and that's what people do. It's also becomes, by the mid 1630s, Boston's kind of full up. You arrive in Boston in 1635, they send you down the muddy river. You're not going to settle there and on Boston Common or something. It's never going to happen.
Too crowded.
So it's become a crowded place. So it's just, there are lots of factors that have to come together to make witchcraft trials happen, and the instance of those factors and the way they mesh together is just different in different places at different times.
The question has come up from several folks looking at sort of alternative explanations for the troubling events or the illnesses of these folks. And you, of course, indicated melancholia and, pervasive sadness and fear was maybe what was gripping some of these folks. But we have questions about, was there perhaps a fungus that infected the rye crops? Was the bread causing hallucinations? The bread flour, were there spoiled grains? So just very generally, is there any specific answer, medical or botanical, for what happened? And it wasn't just human and animal sickness, it was also crop failure, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Well, the ergot theory has been around for quite a while and is usually associated with the Salem witch trials. It's the idea that actually that some of the seizures or even some of the hallucinations are caused by this fungus ergot that grows on rye that gets damp in when it's kept in barns. The difficulty with some of these kind of present-centered explanations is that they might be right, but they take us away, I think, from the mentality of the time. So in the book, I don't talk up, I mentioned diphtheria saying, I don't talk about diphtheria. I use the categories that people used at the time, because I want to make sense of witchcraft as witchcraft in their own mentality. Whereas when one starts putting these other theories, and although they're very interesting, they can sometimes take us away from this contemporary way of viewing the world and put it very much into our way of looking at things. And the difficulty that we have, I think, in the 21st century is looking back and trying to understand witchcraft as witchcraft. We always want to try and make it into something else. So that some of the hallucinations and fits that people have in Springfield, and maybe in Salem as well, that they are certainly consistent with encephalitis. So again, they didn't know what encephalitis was, so I don't talk about it. But that, you know, swelling and pressure in the membrane around the brain can cause these things. I think Mary Parsons, I'm going to talk about, as you say, suffering from melancholy. That's not sadness. Melancholy in the 17th century is clinical depression, but that's the way, that's what I call it, and that's the way they thought of it. I think that Mary Parsons was almost certainly suffering from some kind of postpartum psychosis, which is more than just postnatal depression. It's very rare, postpartum psychosis, but everything that she says and she demonstrates would be consistent with that. So there are lots of kind of modern medical explanation for these things, but if you start slotting those things into a narrative, they always take you out of the moment that you're trying to create, which is one where the textures and the feelings of mid-17th century life are the only things that matter to these people in the story.
So speaking of periods of time, the Salem witch trials were 30, 40 years later than the time period that you're writing about. And several folks have asked sort of, how did that bubble happen again? Or how is this a forerunner of that? Were they in any way connected? And I know your book focuses on Springfield, but can you comment a bit on Salem and the delayed time between the two?
Yeah, certainly. Well, Salem is a very odd thing, and of course, largely because of Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, that we sometimes the Crucible or the Salem witch trials are the only thing that people really know about witch hunting. So they seem to kind of stand in as the typical example of hysteria in a small community where people are unjustly accused and executed. But of course, Salem is an aberration. It's an aberration in New England, and it's nearly always set aside from other statistics of witch hunting in New England because it's such a freakish thing, because 150 people are accused and 19 people are executed and one pressed to death. But you see, you need to compare that to some of the other statistics so that we know about outside Salem, we know about 60 witch trials in the whole history of 17th century New England. That's really not very many when we think about Puritan witch hunting hysteria. So in the 1660s, in New England, there are 19 witch trials, a whole decade. The next decade, the 1670s, there are 6 trials. And in the 1680s, there are 8 trials. This is a really small thing that's diminishing anyway. And then in 1692, Salem. So it's a very odd thing, and it burns itself out remarkably quickly. And actually, people are very sorry, and they ask themselves very searching questions. What on earth did we do? But there are some parallels, again, thinking about this witch hunt as a perfect storm of factors, and that there is a similar kind of perfect storm that happens in Salem as happened at Springfield. These are some of the parallels. Tension between neighbours over land and over authority, economic change, local and beyond, polarising cultures around land and about work and about money, a sense of wavering political and legal authority. Remember, William Pynchon's authority seems to be questioned. Well, at Salem, that there is a power vacuum. There is the knock-on of the Glorious Revolution that doesn't just happen in England in 1688 to 9, but follows on. There's a Glorious Revolution in Boston and throughout New England as well, where these colonies have to declare for the new King and Queen, William and Mary. So at that point, there's a sort of legal vacuum, and all sorts of things happen precisely because there's a vacuum. There's a wave of alarming misfortunes at Salem, as there is in Springfield, often crucially involving children. There's this sense of demonic attack, which people describe. And there's also, finally, there is a similar kind of anxiety about the spread of Puritan dissenters. So in Springfield, it's really about Pynchon and his strange heretical ideas. And at Salem, it is more than anything anxiety about the spread of my ancestors, the Quakers.
We've had questions on that topic of, were these seen among the Quakers? Was it seen among Catholic communities? Was it unique to Puritanism? Do you see crossovers to any of those other religious groups?
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, people sometimes ask me about witch hunting, about whether it's more a Protestant or a Catholic, thing. If you think about the whole history of witch hunting back into the 16th century, and the answer is it's neither. It's not a Protestant or a Catholic belief. It's about tension between competing religious authorities. So you get very intense witch hunting in southern Germany. That's because the tension between Protestants and Catholics there is most intense. And that these aren't just kind of marginal theological issues. In this world, they are existential questions about the whole, the reality of the relationship between a country and God. It's incredibly difficult to recover and to reconstruct just how important and deadly that sort of, question was about, if you get it wrong, it's like you get God's judgment. These are often very fragile communities. So you shouldn't necessarily look for what whether it's Quakers or whether it's Puritans or whether it's Catholics. You should look and see what is the dominant political religion and who most seems to threaten them. And so, as I say, it's not, Quakers don't really do much in Salem except for threaten the status quo by their very existence, because to challenge the religious orthodoxy is in this period to challenge the political authority as well. And in the 18th century, this all loosens up considerably. And that's why really we're into a slightly different world.
Absolutely fascinating. One last question here. Given that the Salem witch trials persecuted, as you said, relatively few people over a short space of time, what do you see may be the reasons for the modern fascination and popular myth building around this very specific period in New England's history?
Well, it's a very good question, and it's this is a very emotive subject, and almost before the witch trials ended in Europe and North America, people started mythologizing about it. And it became a very polemical thing. Again, often, Protestants said that Catholics had, this was the Catholic Inquisitions that done this, and Catholics said, oh, this was just sort of bloody-minded Puritans, and so on. So it's always been a football, always been this ideological, polemical football between sides. But in the modern, in the 21st century, this is just there are questions about class, there are questions about race. I think about Tituba and Salem. There are questions about generational conflict. And I think that all people with an interest in witchcraft generally, and perhaps Salem in particular, see their own kind of interests, their own kind of prejudices sometimes in that story. And that isn't just a modern thing. As I say, going back to the early 18th century, there were people, polemicists, who looked at the story of the witch hunts and thought, we can make this that. And that actually the mythology of witchcraft is part of the history of witchcraft, but it isn't necessarily the story you get when you get the kind of records that historians look at and start to try to reconstruct what happened from the bottom up, rather than looking at it through that prism of all those interpretations that we've had subsequently.
What a remarkable education you've given us, Professor Gaskill. We really thank you for all your wise and very big picture answers. And we have so many questions here. Thank you to all of our participants for all these fascinating questions. They go from the very small, and I have a wonderful list of names of folks that you all are related to who've been accused of witchcraft. It's an amazing list. And there are so many interested parties on the line here. I'm sorry we can't get to all of these questions. There are just too many of them. As we do, though, for all of our authors in the American Inspiration series, we have asked Professor Gaskill to read to us briefly from the book in closing, so you can really hear what this book sounds like, which is remarkable, the narrative. Thank you so much, Professor, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Right, so this is a short reading from right at the beginning of the book, just to give you a specific sense of one person's experience of witchcraft and the terrifying reality that witchcraft actually meant to him. So it's February 1651, and Jonathan Taylor has had an unsettling day, which is not over yet. Arriving home, Taylor lifts the door latch, treading softly to avoid waking his wife, who is 8 months pregnant, and their infant girl beside her. They've lived in the young plantation of Springfield for 2 years, labouring to make something of themselves in this new land. The family sleeps downstairs in one bed near the glowing hearth, which flickers shadows round the low-ceilinged room. Taylor undresses, slips between the coarse sheets. He closes his eyes. But then he's awake, the room suffused with light. He sits up rigid with fear, sensing movement on the floor. He forces himself to look. 3 snakes are slithering toward him. He glances at his wife, but doesn't rouse her, afraid that the shock will hurt their unborn child, nor does he want his daughter to see. The smallest snake, black with yellow stripes, slides up the side of the bed. Taylor strikes it off, but it returns. Again, he lashes out. Heart pounding, he shrinks back against the bolster. Daring to raise his head again, he meets the snake's beady eye. With a flick of its jaws, the creature sinks its fangs into Taylor's forehead. The pain is excruciating, but Taylor is too petrified to move. In the deep voice of a man, a voice he recognizes, the snake breathes the word death. Trembling, Taylor splutters that no man ever died from such a bite. Then the room snaps back to darkness and the snakes are gone. Taylor's tremors wakes his wife. Unable to calm him, she asks if he's cold and whether she should warm his clothes. He replies that he's hot and sick and falls back on the bed, shaking and sweating. All that Thursday night, he writhes feverishly, his mind a confusion of images. But in the morning, Taylor is clear about one thing. He knows who to blame for his torment. The brickmaker, Hugh Parsons.
That is so chilling, so haunting. What a remarkable time in American history, really. Such a fascinating window. Thank you, Malcolm, for sharing this hysteria with us and for offering your insight onto, what it meant and giving us some context on it. You really do write beautifully and hauntingly. I do want to remind our audiences that copies of Malcolm's book, The Ruin of All Witches, are available from Porter Square Books. For so many of us deeply immersed in America's earliest history, this book is an excellent source of information and a must-have for our libraries. Unfortunately, signed copies are not available for this event, but thank you for supporting this author series and independent bookstores by buying through Porter Square Books, who will ship right to your home. Moving toward closing, we at American Ancestors NAHGS are delighted to have presented tonight's book talk and to have been able to welcome Malcolm Gaskill. For those of you who don't know us, please come by our research library in Boston in the coming month or two before we close for renovation. If you're studying a time in history, a cultural trend, a family, or an individual, an accused witch, we can help. If you're outside New England, as most of you are, we encourage you to become a member so you can gain access to our online databases, 1.4 billion searchable family records. Members can delve into these digital archives any time of day or night. Also free to the public, you can chat online with a genealogist, and our Brew Family Learning Center hosts many educational programs geared to all levels for those of you new to researching, to you pros out there. If you're deep into working with hard to read records, some of which you might have seen on screen, don't miss our January 26th online lecture on deciphering old handwriting. And in late February, our education team is hosting a virtual stay at home. Over 3 days, our top genealogists will work with you on your trickiest research questions. They'll help you gain insight and sharpen your skills. You'll find more information at americanancestors.org/events. And for you literary sorts, we invite you to these upcoming virtual author talks, much like today, presented free of charge in the American Inspiration Series. On Thursday, February 2nd, we'll be joined by Dartmouth professor Michael F. Delmond for his discussion of his new work, Half American, the epic story of African Americans fighting World War II at home and abroad. This presentation will be done in partnership with the Boston Public Library, GBH Forum Network, and the Museum of African American History, MAAH, here in Boston. Our moderator will be Harvard PhD candidate Christian Walks, head of MAAH's Education Department. Later in the month, we're going to be welcoming another local luminary as moderator. The Boston Globe's sports columnist and editor, Dan Shaughnessy, will be talking to two authors, giants in the world of biography and sports history, the Pulitzer Prize winner Paul Moranis of the Washington Post and Jeff Pearlman, formerly of Sports Illustrated and ESPN. For us, they'll debate sports history. Who is the greatest American athlete, Jim Thorpe or Bo Jackson? Don't miss this lively presentation, a free event produced in partnership with GBH Forum Network and the Boston Public Library. And on Thursday, January 26th, we're welcoming NPR legal reporter Nina Totenberg and CBS correspondent Rita Braver for a discussion about Nina's best-selling book, Dinners with Ruth, which is, of course, about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her many colleagues on the Supreme Court. This event is not free of charge. It's a virtual benefit for American Ancestors, NEHGS. With your ticket purchase, you'll be supporting our nonprofit research programs and publications, and you'll also get a signed copy of Nina's book sent to your home. So do look at americanancestors.org/events for more information. Okay, back to today's program, truly winding down. Professor Gaskill, Malcolm, thank you for this wonderful program and exploration of 17th century America. As scary as it might be, you've really given us some great insight. And from all of us behind the scenes, we also thank our audience. There are more than 800 of you out there today, fellow history lovers. We wish you a very good afternoon and evening. And Malcolm, thank you for joining us this evening from overseas in the UK. We are so grateful.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's been a real pleasure. And thank you to everyone who's taken part.
Thank you, and good night to all.
Goodbye.